Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Maria Gutierrez Vera, and I'm one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows this year. It is hard to turn on the news or scroll through Twitter without hearing or seeing some pundit talk about issues of the Middle East. This region occupies a large part of our collective political discourse and consciousness, and yet most Americans still could not tell you much about the region beyond sensational headlines. The region that we call the Middle East is composed of 18 countries across the Levant, Arabian Peninsula, Anatolia, including modern Turkey and Cyprus, Egypt, Iran, and Iraq. It is a richly diverse and beautiful place with a long history spanning back millennia. Today, over 60 languages are spoken in the region, including Arabic, Greek, and Kurdish, making it one of the most linguistically diverse regions in the world. Further, by my count, there are at least 30 religions and religious sects active in the region. Here tonight to speak about some of the most pressing issues in the Middle East is our speaker, Hagar Chemali. Chemali is a political satirist, foreign policy expert, and host, writer, and producer of a world news show on YouTube called Oh My World. She is a political commentator and writer on national security issues, and is featured regularly on MSNBC, CNN, BBC, Bloomberg, and Cheddar. She is also CEO and founder of Greenwich Media Strategies, and a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Economic Sanctions Initiative. Chemali is also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She has over a decade's experience working for the federal government, where she worked in a range of senior national security and public affairs positions. From 2010 to 2012, Chemali was the director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council at the White House, where she advised on and coordinated the implementation of U.S. policy towards Syria and Lebanon. Chemali also worked at the Treasury Department as a senior policy advisor on Asia and Middle East policy, advisor in the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes. She is also spokesperson for the Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where she handled all public affairs related to sanctions policy, illicit finance, and enforcement actions. From 2015 to 2016, Chemali was Director of Communications and spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the United Nations under President Barack Obama. Chemali holds a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, where she concentrated in international security policy in the Middle East. She is also a graduate of Barnard College, where she majored in political science. Ms. Chemali's Athenaeum Talk is supported by the Siam Family Foundation and co-sponsored by the McGrulian Center for Human Rights at CMC. Now, before I finish my introduction, we have a short video to introduce our speaker.
Don't watch this show. The biggest news this week. Excuse me, Vladdy, if I wanted to do a political ad on Facebook, how would I do that? I believe it's Trump who stole my look. Are you kidding me? I said we want all sanctions lifted. It's okay, I'm prepared. I'm Hagar and I host Oh My World, and in 10 minutes once a week, I'll cover the top world news stories in a fun and easy way and why they matter to you. Click below to subscribe.
Thank you. Now, before we begin, we must ask that you all abide by the Athenaeum's health and etiquette guidelines. Please keep your masks on over your nose and mouth for the duration of the program indoors. If you would like to take a drink of water, we kindly ask that you exit the Egger dining room to do so. Please take a moment now to silence and put away your cell phones. Check that your mask is properly fitted, and remember that, as always, video and audio recordings are strictly prohibited. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Hagar Chemali to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum.
It is so great to be here. It is such a beautiful campus. As she mentioned, I went to Barnard College, so I was in the city, and it was very different. I did try to hook my bike, though, to that white noodly looking thing, and someone told me that it's art. Sorry about that, sorry. I'm so excited to be here, especially the fact that we are in person, which is amazing. I understand last year you didn't have this in person. I'm so excited because it is my first in-person talk since February 2020. Everything has been virtual since, so I'm so happy. Shout out to the vaccinated people. I promised the college I wouldn't joke too much, so that was my last one. Don't worry. So we're going to talk about the Middle East and the biggest challenges and the hot topics. So I should be done in about 4 days. So sit tight, and we'll get through everything, I promise. Actually, I'm hoping to do this in 20 minutes, 25 minutes. I do talk a little fast, so if I need to slow down, let me know. I'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. We're going to do foreign policy games. I expect you guys to volunteer. I have gifts for those who volunteer. Those who are from my head table, I better see you volunteering for the foreign policy games. So why don't we start with Iran? I figured we'd start with the big fish, at least the big fish for the Biden administration. They've promised to pursue a new Iran nuclear deal, right? So I want to walk it back a little bit and explain to you the background of the Iran nuclear deal, how it started, what happened, where we think where we're headed, and what the problems are that might be coming at us. So I actually worked at the Treasury Department on the Iran deal. Most people at the Treasury Department actually never thought it would happen. We just kind of have a different view, I guess, of how much nefarious behavior Iran was willing to give up. And also, Treasury people really love sanctions. I'm sure those of you who were in the talk earlier today in Professor Taw's class, I love sanctions. Ali Velshi from MSNBC once said about me that I had never met a sanction I didn't like. That is not entirely true. There are a lot of sanctions I don't like, but I do tend to view them as a very potent and awesome tool to achieve national security objectives. So I was at the Treasury Department at the time, and the idea behind the nuclear deal was to take off this one bad thing off the table. And the criticism behind it, and this was the criticism that President Trump had given, was that it didn't encompass all of Iran's nefarious behavior, right? Meaning support for terrorism across the Middle East, support for the proxies, support for militias, human rights abuse, and their other ballistic missiles and other conventional weaponry or non-conventional weaponry. And so as a result, President Trump, as you know, withdrew. The deal was finished in 2015. President Trump withdrew in 2018. And now President Biden has said many times, especially in the campaign, this is a big priority for him. He wants to re-enter the deal. The problem now is that it's just not the same situation anymore. The circumstances are a bit different. On one hand, you have the Europeans are pretty pissed at us that we walked away. People don't really trust anymore that if we can stay in a deal, that if the presidents change, that maybe the deal will disappear again. And what happened now with all the kind of unraveling is that Iran has now started enriching uranium again, and in about a month time, meaning now, I mean like literally in a few weeks, they will have enough uranium for a nuclear weapon. And that goes beyond where they were before the deal was struck in 2015. So the problem with that is that it gives them more leverage than they had before. So the Biden team has said that this is what they're going to pursue. Now I've caught you up with where we are now. They have some folks assigned for talking. The talks are not direct. They are, at least for now, through European intermediaries. That was during the video when you saw that I said that we want all sanctions lifted. And then you saw somebody running. That was me portraying the talks in Vienna that, as you can imagine, are not extremely efficient, given that it's through European intermediaries. And the Iranians have said that they don't want to enter into negotiations unless sanctions are lifted, the sanctions that were lifted in 2015. The Biden team has told them to go pound sand. So this is where we are right now. But the problem that you face is that the Biden team faces a bit more pressure than the Obama team did to deliver on a deal. And the reason for that is that the Obama administration, the view was, if we get a deal, great. If we don't, we tried, right? But the Biden team is now trying to undo something that President Trump undid, or redo something President Trump undid. And so they feel the pressure to come with something, and the Iranians know that. And so the Iranians are very good at negotiating. They're very good at playing the long game. They're very shrewd. They're very sophisticated in their ways of negotiating. And they are very good at collecting bargaining chips and increasing their leverage. So it's going to be a little bit tricky on that front. A few points that I think are important for you to know on Iran. First, sanctions can work. They are what brought the Iranians to the negotiating table in 2013 originally. The Iranians have said repeatedly that and by the way, sorry, when I say Iranians, I'm talking about the Iranian government. I'm not talking about the Iranian people, very different. I really try to make that distinction in my own show a lot. So the Iranian government repeatedly has said that sanctions are a big focus. They want to get rid of sanctions, and so I expect that to motivate them. But I do expect the Biden team, from what I've heard from my friends, to give a few concessions. It's not abnormal to remove some sanctions to allow for talks to take place. It happened when I was working on the deal under President Obama, but hopefully it'll be incremental so that the U.S. doesn't give its leverage away. The second thing that you want to be careful of or know about with this situation is I do expect a deal to be reached. The issue that the Biden team is going to face, what makes it such an uphill challenge, is that because everybody is worried about a deal sticking around or having, staying in place, the Biden team is now going to have to convince the American public and leaders on both sides of the political aisle in Congress that the deal will be good, that it should stay. They need to get the buy-in into it. Otherwise, all of our international partners are going to assume that with the change in presidents, it could just disappear. And what makes that difficult is that a lot of folks have been promised by the Biden team that this deal will encompass all of Iran's bad behavior. The problem with that is that if that had been possible under Obama, Obama would have done it. So it's a little bit tricky. I do expect some kind of deal, though, because this is an absolute priority for the Biden administration. But I think Washington's going to hate it, as they did the first time, and it'll give a lot of fodder for cable news, that's for sure. The third thing that we need to be aware of for Iran is that we can't take our eye off of the threats that Iran poses. Since the killing of General Soleimani, do you guys remember when that happened? It feels like 5 years ago. It was January of 2020. But President Trump assassinated General Soleimani. General Soleimani was a bad dude. He wasn't very well known. He wasn't as known as Osama bin Laden, for example, like the name. But I can tell you, having been in government, worked in counterterrorism, almost every single threatening or aggressive or bad act that came from the Iranian government, and specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's kind of their paramilitary wing, stemmed from General Soleimani. And he was sanctioned as a terrorist. He was a bad guy. So President Trump assassinates him, and the Iranian government is still looking to avenge for his death. And in the grand scheme of things, I think we're better off without him. I know a lot of people in the Middle East would agree with that because he was a big part of Iran's pursuit in human rights abuse. He was a big part in fashioning Iran's foreign policy in terms of exporting influence through supporting militants and terrorists. But things are inherently less stable after his killing. And since that point, the Iranian government has promised to avenge for his death. They've threatened vessels, whether they be American vessels, British vessels, Israeli vessels. There was a plot that was unfoiled where they were going to target the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, Lana Marks. I'm not really sure why they picked her. She makes bags, but whatever. And they always pose a threat in kidnapping U.S.-Iranian dual citizens. It is hostage taking is a big part of how they try to develop these bargaining chips to achieve these goals. So these are all things that we're going to have to stay aware of. So now that I gave you some, not so bad news in the Middle East, let's move to Lebanon, which I figured I'd really bring the audience down a notch. I want to talk about Lebanon. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the news in Lebanon. I wanted to talk about not just because I'm Lebanese American, which I am. My parents are both from Beirut. I am born in Greenwich, Connecticut, which looks nothing like Beirut. But it's not just because of that I want to talk about it. It is because it is a big problem. So what you're having right now in Lebanon is one of the worst economic crises. In fact, the New York Times called it the third worst economic crisis over the last 2 centuries. So you can imagine how bad that might be. And the problem is that there's really no good outlook. So I want to explain to you how we got here. Things started to rapidly unravel in Lebanon 2 years ago when protests started. Now, they unraveled 2 years ago, but what they were doing was lifting the blanket off of really decades of economic mismanagement, political turmoil, post-Civil War issues. But they started to unravel 2 years ago with protests. What sent people into the street in Lebanon was that the government, which is very corrupt and always looking to make money, I love how you're nodding, yes. They proposed a tax on WhatsApp. You know WhatsApp, like the free texting service that is owned by Facebook on your phone? Well, so they proposed a tax, and this is what sent people in the streets en masse. The thing that I always find interesting with the Lebanese, and I can say this because, is, there is massive corruption. There has been massive corruption there forever. There are very few job prospects. The economy has been going down a slope for many, many years. Trash has been polluting the country, the air, the food that they eat, the water that they drink for the last few years because the situation is so corrupt that they can't figure out how to pick the trash up and whose government official's business is the one that gets that lucrative bid. But taxing WhatsApp, that's what sent them into the streets. Don't mess with Lebanese WhatsApp. So, whatever. I was happy that they just went into the streets. So, they went into the streets, they started protesting, the government resigned, and from there, everything started to unravel. People went, when things are unstable, and this is the case for any country really, but when things are unstable, one of the first things people do is go to the bank to get their money out, right? They're very afraid of what's gonna happen, they're afraid of what's gonna happen to their currency, they wanna get their savings out. Well, because of that, the government and the banks imposed a rule on how much money people could take out. And a really strict rule. I am not talking about a few thousand a week, I'm talking about a couple hundred a week, right? 200 to 300 a week. And when you have a family and you have bills and you have things like that, that's really nothing. It's impossible to live on. And the reason they imposed this, maybe I shouldn't play with this, I talk a lot with my hands. The reason they imposed this rule wasn't just to avoid a run on the banks, it was because the bank didn't have the people's money. And where the money had gone was that they loaned it to the government at the government's request. This is a government that has been corrupt for years, and it's a country that is a chief importing country, meaning they import almost everything. They import medicine, they import goods, they import fuel, most importantly. And because the government is so corrupt, they never had this they were never incentivized to change anything, to privatize companies, right? So they're importing fuel, they are, the government officials have their businesses, their own businesses that profit off of that, that in the shipping of it, in the selling it, they're skimming off part of it and selling it to Syria, right? It's all kind of a dirty, corrupt game, and as a result, they had no incentive to change, and as time wore on, the government continued to go into debt. For as long as I was in government, economists used to say that the economy of Lebanon was hanging by a thread and that it was about to implode. And I remember sitting there thinking like, it doesn't seem like that when I go. It's like nonstop partying when I go. And it is. Let me tell you something about Lebanese people. They literally could have no president. There could be a mass blast, which happened. I'll get to that. There could be, just outages everywhere, and they're just like, but let's go party, right? Tonight we party. So you feel like, no, it's okay, but the Lebanese are resilient and they're gonna hang on. And that was largely the case for a long time. Lebanon kind of survived on remittances, people like me in the diaspora sending money back to their family, and they relied on donations from other countries, and really a charm offensive, right? The Lebanese are very charming. Don't you see me? I'm charming, no? So, okay, the Lebanese are very charming and very good bullshit artists. Sorry, but it's true. Okay, whatever. Anyway, so they were able to convince people to consistently give them donations, but at the end of the day, it was kind of masking all these problems, and the protests are what really brought everything up to the surface, right? The fact that people wanted their money, the money wasn't there, the government had spent it, the government can't repay the loans to the banks. And now you have a situation where the currency has lost over 90% of its value over the last 2 years. What that means is that if you used to make $1,000 a month, you now, or whatever was valued at $1,000 a month, you now make $70 a month, valued at $70 a month. Couple that with massive inflation. Inflation is at 146%. Food inflation is at 400%. I mean, it's astronomical when you think about it, right? And on top of it, unemployment is at 40%. Now, on top of this horrific situation, You add the mass blast that happened last year. The mass blast, I'm sure you all saw the footage of this. This was 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate sitting at the port in Beirut. Again, very emblematic of a corrupt government that doesn't pay attention to things, that points the finger at people, that's very bureaucratic, that doesn't move toward progress. And this 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, blew up and caused an explosion that is said to be one of the believed to be the third world's worst in the world. Third, you get what I'm trying to say, right? And just to give you an idea of the size of the explosion, the Oklahoma City bombing was 2 tons of ammonium nitrate, and this was almost 3,000 tons. It killed over 200 people, it injured thousands, and it displaced hundreds of thousands of people. All this during a pandemic that was ravaging the country. So now you have, this is a pretty depressing situation. On top of it now, what you have most recently is that the country is actively running out of fuel. So it used to have very little fuel, a lot of electricity outages. Now, not only do you have the electricity outages, but people don't have fuel to fuel the generators that were powering things. And when you think about that, to think of the gravity of that, that's not just your house and your fridge. That's ventilators for people in hospitals. That's respirators, right? These things that have a very real effect on people's lives. Medicine shelves in pharmacies are empty. It's hard to find even the most basic medicines, things like Tylenol or, well, for them, Panadol. But anyway, right, very difficult. So the government has changed a number of times over the last 2 years. You have a new government very recently, a prime minister that when I was in the White House at Washington, we refused to let him visit Washington, D.C. Nobody seems to know that. So I plan on advertising that as much as possible because he's corrupt and because he wasn't really seen as a friend to the West. He has promised reform and change and so on to Lebanon. The IMF has promised money to Lebanon if it pursues economic reform, but so far nobody has wanted to pursue that reform because it would end up taking money away from government officials that benefit off of these corrupt projects, right? The benefiting off of the proceeds of the country's resources or businesses and so on. And so I don't know, unfortunately for Lebanon, if I had a crystal ball, I would say that that it's not looking very promising, that it will end up economically kind of like Venezuela without the human rights abuse and repression, and that it'll take years to get them out. And this is all without even talking about one of the biggest problems there, and that's Hezbollah. I haven't even talked about the terrorist organization there. And the problem with Hezbollah, aside from the fact that it holds the government hostage and prevents it from moving forward in a lot of ways, is that with every year that passes, it invites Iran's influence more and more. And a great example of this just happened a few weeks ago where for a country that is unable to pay for fuel or to bring oil in because the government is completely bankrupt, Hezbollah brought in Iranian oil into the country. And the problem with that is that it could put the whole country at risk of getting sanctioned for doing something like that because US sanctions target anybody importing Iranian oil. Right now, the Treasury Department and State Department aren't going to sanction Lebanon for that. They're pretty aware that Lebanon's in dire straits, but it just doesn't portend a very positive future. So, do I still have you? Yes, good, okay. Nobody needs to get up and do a little dance, a little shake. No, okay, good. Let's move to brighter pastures down south to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You know, the irony of it is that compared to most of the conflict right now and economic depression in the Middle East, I have a little hope for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, maybe. So why don't I catch you up on what happened over the summer, and we'll talk about the issues at hand and where things could go from here, and why I say that I have a sliver of hope compared to Lebanon in particular. Was nobody going to say that my dress was open? You were trying to tell me? Damn, Rent the Runway. So next time you should all raise your hand and tell me. All right, so I don't usually love to talk about this conflict, and the reason is because before you even start, you've offended somebody. And I made fun of that in my video where you saw me at one point. I don't know if you noticed, I had a ski hat and goggles and a tray, and I was using it to back off, to shield myself from tomatoes. And because I was making a joke at the time, and that was before my segment on what was happening with the Hamas and Israel airstrikes over the summer, where I started off and said, like, you cannot talk about this issue without offending somebody and somebody throwing biblical references at you. So I'm going to give you the rundown of what happened over the summer, and then talk about the opportunity that I think that's there that, to be honest with you, I don't really see the Biden administration seizing just yet, but hopefully they will. So the tensions over the summer, I'm going to give you the details, and then if it's too much detail for you, let me know. But it's complicated, and the core here that I want you to understand is that you can't point fingers, right? This is a problem on all sides. So the tensions over the summer started during the month of Ramadan, when it's a holy month that Muslim Palestinians celebrate, and they usually celebrate in a public square. So they went to the public square to celebrate, and Israeli forces prevented them from doing so. So this automatically, it started tensions, it started clashes. They set up blockades to prevent some of these public Palestinian festivals that usually take place in this square. From there, tensions started to grow. You had a march of thousands of far-right Jewish supporters that wanted to confront the Palestinians that were clashing with the police at the public square for having set up those blockades. From there, the tensions continued. Young Palestinians launched a campaign on TikTok where they were harassing or slapping or beating Jews on subways and so on. And then in reaction, young Jews started filming themselves beat up Palestinians in the streets and so on in downtown West Jerusalem. So now you have regular Israeli and Palestinian citizens and youth taking matters into their own hands, which is never what you want to see. At the same time, as all of this is happening, there is a court process to try and evict 6 Palestinian families from an area in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah. East Jerusalem is, so if you go to Jerusalem, East Jerusalem it's all right next to each other. East Jerusalem is traditionally populated by Palestinians, and the U.S. consulate that serves Palestinians is in Jerusalem, near East Jerusalem. That's the one that I don't know if you remember, but when President Trump closed, when he said moved the embassy, he said he would move the embassy to Jerusalem as a means of recognizing it and close that consulate that serves the Palestinians. President Biden has since reopened that consulate. So anyway, this is trying to give you an idea of physically where we are. So you had the evictions going on, the Israeli settlers saying that they want the Palestinians who have been living there for a long time. We can get into why they were there for a long time. It's actually a very long story that dates back to 1948 and homes that were given to them by Jordan. Anyway, it's all very complicated, but the Israeli court was trying to evict them, and so then you had clashes starting from that. All at the same time, you had a march that was being planned on something called Jerusalem Day, and that march was eventually canceled. The Palestinians had protested. What happened, though, is that it ended up culminating into clashes at the Al-Aqsa Mosque during prayers, where Palestinians threw stones at the police. The police started firing back with rubber bullets and tear gas, and you had clashes there. Okay? I haven't even gotten to the big part yet, but this is to give you the background of how we got to the airstrikes. Hamas, which is a terrorist organization based in Gaza, saw what was going on and saw it as an opportunity to take advantage of this situation. And so they started lobbying airstrikes. Israel responded, obviously, with overwhelming force, right? And then what you ended up having, so this lasted a while, and you ended up the death count, which was quite disproportionate. Israel lost 13 people. The Palestinians lost over 260 people, half of whom were civilians, including women and children. So this is to give you, okay, so now I've caught you up to I summarized what happened over the summer, all right? Why let's analyze a little bit. Why the disproportionate number? First, on one part, because Israel has the Iron Dome, something that the United States paid for. The Iron Dome has 90% efficiency in striking down missiles that are lobbed into Israel, right? So on one hand, it's very effective at targeting them and getting rid of them. On the other hand, Israel has always responded with this kind of overwhelming response. And one of the things I explained to folks, because a lot of folks didn't understand it, and I'm not justifying it, I'm just analyzing it and explaining. If you had a terrorist organization across the border in Canada or Mexico, and they started lobbing missiles at the United States, the United States would likely respond with heavy force. The problem that you have, though, is that when you have that many civilians, right, it's to kill that many civilians is just irresponsible and criminal, right? And it's also counterproductive, most importantly, because what you're going to end up doing when you do that is losing the ability to have a group of people identify that it's the terrorist organization that put them at risk, right? And those folks are going to hold those grievances, and then they might join the terrorist organization in the future. And again, the cycle continues, right? And this is something that Israel, I find, really fundamentally gets wrong. So this is to explain where you have now. The ceasefire has held since then, but we'll have to see. It's a generally shaky situation. At the core of this is the fact that you don't have two states. Now, this is where I see the opportunity. A lot of folks made fun of the Abraham Accords when President Trump came out with them. But those are, in fact, a big deal, the Abraham Accords. And the reason is because, and not a lot of you will remember this. I think you were probably, toddlers when this was the case. But before the Arab Spring, before things were really shaky in many of the countries there, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the worst one in the region. And it was the one that every Arab used to say, if you can solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then you've got the rest of the Middle East solved, right? You've got Lebanon solved and Syria solved and so on. That's not so much the case right now, but that's why these deals that were created with Bahrain, the UAE, Sudan, and Morocco are a big deal. And those countries with Israel all stand to benefit enormously economically and from a security cooperation standpoint. And the thing is, the Palestinians feel left out on that, right? Mahmoud Abbas, the president, was very upset about the first deal that was announced. He felt kind of left out. He felt like he wasn't consulted. But Palestinians themselves are changing. Many of them don't support Hamas. And many of them don't support Mahmoud Abbas either, because he's pretty weak and he's pretty corrupt. And there is a growing movement on the ground for more transparency, for a different leader. And that is why I say I have a tiny sliver of hope that things could change, because I think that the Palestinians will see, you know what, we want a piece of this economic opportunity. Now, in Israel, you have a new leader, Naftali Bennett, who is not really that different than Bibi Netanyahu, except that he is more willing to pursue a relationship with the United States, whereas Netanyahu wasn't really. But from a policy standpoint, it's kind of the same. He doesn't support the Iran deal, and he doesn't support a two-state solution, which is a problem. But honestly, I wouldn't hold your breath that he'll be around too much longer, because there are political problems in Israel. Their government changes very, very rapidly. So we'll see what happens. The thing that I hope is that the Biden administration seizes this opportunity. There was news that broke this week that they had done away with an office that was working on these deals. Some of it may have been kind of a post-Trump reaction to undo things, but if they don't pursue some kind of talks now following these deals, I personally think it would be a lost opportunity. All right, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. I love to talk about Saudi Arabia. Because people don't talk about Saudi Arabia enough, and because I think that one is where you're going to see a lot of movement and action in the coming few years with the Biden administration. So, for a lot of reasons, we have long had this special relationship with Saudi Arabia, right? It dates back to oil. It dates to, you're talking counterterrorism operations. There has been a lot of foreign direct investment from the Saudis in things that you may not even be aware of, like WeWork and Uber. And they maintain a relatively, not normalized, but a fine relationship with Israel. I would argue that Saudi Arabia stands to gain a lot more from us than we do from them at this stage. Things like arms sales, which are on hold at the moment, but normally arms sales, military and intelligence cooperation, counterterrorism cooperation, support for the Yemen coalition, which we are still technically part of, involvement for what they have is called the Saudi Vision 2030, which is their effort to diversify their economy and kind of grow like a tech sector, which is something that a lot of US companies, even after the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, which I'll get into, a lot of them are still involved in this. And their ability to use the United States to further their repression. But the thing about the Saudi government is that it's not a good government. And Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, I call him Mohammed Baby Salman on my show. I can't go back to Saudi Arabia now. And is that he hasn't proven to be a very good leader. There was a lot of hope when he came to power. He was educated abroad. He kind of said that he had this modern vision. People were hopeful for women's rights there. But then he kidnapped, sort of jailed the Lebanese prime minister. He started jailing, I guess, sort of imprisoning his own government officials in the Ritz. He has been horrific on his human rights track record is an abomination. He and his team obviously brutally murdered Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi at the consulate in Turkey, and he has posed threats to the United States directly. And that's not something people talk about here. It's something that people shy away from. I am obviously not afraid to say that, but he had spies placed at Twitter, using Twitter and a US tech company to spy on Saudi dissidents and activists. The Saudi government has not been very good at vetting its military officials or diplomats that are sent to the United States. You had 2 military officials conduct a terrorist attack in Pensacola, Florida. You had 1 Saudi diplomat who was supporting the 9/11 hijackers. That news, believe it or not, just came out a few weeks ago, but barely got any coverage. He also kind of blackmailed Jeff Bezos. So kind of a weird move on that I would think. But anyway, so the Saudi government is something that Biden has proposed a course correction. And he's been pursuing it so far, and it's not bad. The first thing he said was that he would not talk to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, that he wouldn't engage with him, and that the reason he wouldn't, the reason he gave at least, was that it wasn't his level, right? The king, his father, the king is his level. This actually matters a lot, because if Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman can't get meetings around the world, then technically the king could appoint a different crown prince. So the crown prince has to be careful, the crown prince baby. You also have, Biden has put a hold on arms sales, which is a very important one, something that President Trump was not willing to do, and something that President Obama wasn't willing to do. And he imposed sanctions, additional sanctions, in reaction to the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, though a lot of human rights activists, and I would agree with this, could argue that they could have been stronger. The thing that I want to note about Saudi Arabia is that unlike Iran or China, if you punch at Saudi Arabia, they're not really going to punch back. And the reason is because of what I said before, that they stand to gain a lot more from the United States than the United States stands to gain from them. And so far, these course corrections from President Biden have not resulted in any negative consequences. So I'm hopeful that continues, and that as a result, you're going to see more on the Saudi front in terms of slightly better behavior, especially as it comes to human rights. They did release a few key activists when Biden was coming to office. One of them is one of the most famous and well-known is a woman named Loujain al-Hathloul. Loujain is a women's rights activist and was kidnapped and imprisoned, where she was tortured. She fought for the right for women to drive and was recently released. So hopefully things like that will continue. Do we have time for Syria and Yemen? You guys want to talk Syria and Yemen? I told you it's a whole host of problems in the Middle East. As I talk about things that increase your blood pressure, squeeze the stress balls. That's what they're there for, right? It's, just release, it's the Middle East. You can't work in the Middle East or national security if you don't like complicated problems. So I don't know if we have time to to catch you up on where we are with Syria and Yemen in terms of how we got to where we got. What I will do for you is give you a little brief, just where we are on each, because nobody is talking about it, which I also think, unfortunately, is reflective of where the US government has prioritized Syria and Yemen. So things in Syria have changed a little bit in that it's not as much of an all-out civil war. You don't have ISIS as strong as before. But it's a very, very unsafe country. You still have oppositionists fighting the government. You still have the government brutalizing and repressing people. You have a lot of detained political prisoners, missing people who are being tortured en masse. So things there are still not getting better. The problem that you face is that there has been this acceptance among the world that it's not as bad as before, and that maybe we have to accept President Assad. And the problem, the huge, huge problem I see with that, and so I came from being at the White House handling Syria, the first 2 years of the Syria crisis, where our argument was that President Assad had to go at any cost, almost any cost, since we didn't do much to push him out. But the reason we said that is because the violence and the civil war that ensued and the repression that ensued is entirely his fault. Right? One could argue, we could make many arguments that Russia helped and Iran helped, and because we had invaded Iraq and Al-Qaeda in Iraq was created, that helped form ISIS, right? I understand that everybody has a hand in the pot, but if Assad hadn't responded to protests with the indiscriminate violence that he did, you wouldn't have had this massive and brutal civil war that ensued. And the problem is, if he reigns in power, people won't go back to Syria, because if they do, they will likely be detained and tortured, right? So that's the first problem. And the second huge problem is that this is a leader who gassed his citizens. So if the whole world says, all right, he gassed his citizens, but like we really need to work with somebody in Syria, and we really need to see things move forward. So we're just going to keep him there, and we just won't say anything. We're just going to pretend the last decade didn't happen. It sends a message to authoritarian and brutal tyrants around the world that no matter what they do to their people and to their land, nobody will really do anything. And you see that effect. You do see that effect happening. You do see human rights abusers behaving worse, tyrants behaving worse, dictators behaving worse, especially over the last 10 years. Yemen continues to be a major, major problem. The Saudis are continuing their campaign there, and the Houthis are extremely heavily armed because of Iran. And what you really end up having is, it is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it is playing out in Yemen. So you have one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Last year, it was labeled as the worst. I believe it's still the worst, but Ethiopia, unfortunately, which is not the Middle East, so we're not talking about that today, but you can ask me in Q&A, is catching up with them. But so the problem is, you have hundreds of thousands, millions of civilians who are at risk of famine and death, and no prospects for the future, while these two sides fight each other brutally. And there is, I don't want to pretend that like, oh, but this side should know better or that side should know better. They're both bad. They're both behaving like criminals. And that situation continues, and unfortunately, you really never hear of it, not just in the news, but from the US government either. So, I think I've talked your ear off enough. I want to give you a quick, to conclude, I want to give you an overview just of, I've enumerated for you the problems with all these countries, right? I've listed it by country. And that's very government. That's what we do in government, right? It's like, okay, what's the problem with Iran? What's the goal, and how do we get there? What's the problem with Saudi Arabia? What's the goal, and how do we get there? But at the end of the day, the core issue that you have, the problem that you have across the Middle East, is really bad leadership, right? It's either tyrants or bad, corrupt leaders. No matter what system you have, it's these horrific leaders that are imposing this repression, conflict, allowing extremism or terrorism to grow, continuing situations of conflict because perhaps they feed off of it or they are able to stay in power, right? It's power-hungry, bad leaders. And one of the things I really wish that the US government would do is take a step back and approach these things from a more strategic 60,000 foot level standpoint and say, well, if we could partner with other like-minded partners all over the world and make the world an impossible place for tyrants and bad leaders, and not allow them, for example, things like UN membership at the World Bank, membership at the IMF, and not allow them access to the international financial system. Just make it impossible to be a corrupt leader or a tyrant, then perhaps that's how you could fundamentally get at the core of these problems. It's an interesting thought. Thank you so much for having me and for letting me talk your ears off. I have some foreign policy games to lighten the mood, and most exciting, wait, how do I go backwards? Okay, good. Yes, time for FOPO games. FOPO on my show stands for foreign policy. For those of you who volunteer for the games, I've got 3 games. I need 2 volunteers for each, just to give you kind of a safety blanket, right? Like, so one of you's gonna know the answer. You get this beautiful water bottle. Glorious Geek is what it says. I call my audience Glorious Geeks. Obviously, you know that because you subscribe to my show. How many of you subscribe to my show? I mean, lie a little. I'm like up here, right? Don't leave me hanging. All right, you're all getting merch, so I expect you to go to the YouTube channel and click subscribe. It's free. You'd be surprised how many times people ask me how to do it. Just go to the red button that says subscribe and click it. And if you are already logged into your Gmail, then it will be easier for you. So just do that. So 2 of you will get these water bottles if you volunteer. The first game is called FOPO or FOPO. And what I mean is I will give you multiple choice questions, and you have to tell me which is the real FOPO, which is the real foreign policy that happened, or geopolitical event. So, 2 volunteers. Yes, that was so easy. Okay, you 2. That was quick. You guys thought I wouldn't have volunteers. The water bottle is a good water bottle. I did not cheap out on these water bottles. Yeah. Okay, guys. So, FOPO or FOPO? Ready? Which of these is the real FOPO? A couple of Americans tried to invade Venezuela to overthrow its dictator, Nicolas Maduro. A. B. North Korea's Kim Jong-un has gotten so thin that his people have called for an investigation to make sure the real Kim Jong-un isn't hiding somewhere. Or C. In his meltdown over the US, UK, Australia submarine deal, that's the one that you hear of called AUKUS, French President Macron didn't just recall his French ambassadors back home, but he also banned Coca-Cola and Vegemite from France. They're all ridiculous, right? But one is real. Do you know which one? You can consult. That's the idea. You guys are a team. You both get the water bottle. No, you're not playing against each other. Yes, you are a team. Teamwork, yes. So confer amongst each other and decide which is the real one.
I'm guessing it's B. Did it not happen?
Wow, I will say that if you watched my show, you would definitely know the answer to this. So now you have to watch. You could take like a vote. You want me to see if I give you a hint?
Can we get some like audience feedback? What do you guys think? Let's see the hint. Let's see the hint. Well, we know it's not C.
It's not C.
Okay. I guess it's supposed to be good.
So your vote, your what you think it is?
Yeah, that's good. We're going with B. All right, B.
It is A. The point of this game, there are 3 questions. Where are you going? Stay up here. Yeah. The point of this game is to show you how ridiculous things are around the world. Okay. Which of these is the real FOPO? A. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called fellow conservative German Chancellor Angela Merkel and begged her to stay in office. B. The Chinese government has banned the English language in Hong Kong. Or C. Russian President Vladimir Putin tried to kill opposition leader Alexei Navalny by poisoning his underwear.
let's go
It's
with
C. Isn't that ridiculous? They put Novichok in his underwear, and he went on an airplane, and then he fell into a coma, and anyway, it's a long story. Anyway, but now he's back in Russia in a prison. So, okay. Which of these is the real FOPO? A, the Iranian regime tried to kidnap a US-based women's rights activist from Brooklyn by taking her to Venezuela by speedboat. B, US officials in embassies abroad are being attacked by energy waves. Or C, earlier this year, the Myanmar military detained and arrested Prime Minister Aung San Suu Kyi because they said she illegally imported walkie-talkies.
Maybe not.
What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'll trust you. Let's go with B.
We're going with B.
Okay, this one is a trick question. All of them are true.
What?
All of them are right. Sometimes I tell people that world news, it's like free content. It is so ridiculous that it is easy to make a political satire show about it. That is the last question. You both get the water bottles. Good job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being so brave. All right, the next game, I need 2 volunteers, is called How Geeky Are You? This one has 2 questions. Yes. Yes, great, perfect. Okay, and there was someone over there. You'll do the 3rd game. Okay, cool. So, how geeky are you? Who's this guy? Is it A, actor John Malkovich? B, North Dakota Senator John Hoeven? I think that's how you say it. Or C, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko? C is right. C is right. That is actor John Malkovich, and this is the Senator John Hoeven. Thank you, Sydney, for helping me with this. It was a huge help. All right, next question. What place is this? This place has recently taken a major step against women's rights. C. But it could have been any of them, right? Yeah, but it is C. You are right. Well done. You guys have 2 bottles. Huh? Here you go. Well done. All right. Here you go. Thank you for volunteering. So I had one back here and I need another. Oh, with her, okay. Oh, see, now people are volunteering. I need to think of, look at how many people. Oh, okay, well, we did these 2 and we'll figure out a way to do more. Okay, name that dictator. This dictator brought down an airplane that happened to be flying over his country in order to arrest an activist journalist who was living in exile, but who was on board. Is this Russian President Vladimir Putin, Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko, or Iranian leader Ibrahim Raisi? B is right. Well done. This dictator lured an outspoken critic of his government to an embassy abroad in order to brutally murder him. Is this A, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi? I call him el-Sisi on my show. B, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who I call Bashar the Butcher on my show. Or C, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. C, good. See, you guys were worried, these are easy. Last one. This dictator has ordered his military to slowly take over a body of water and to do it in part by dumping their sewage there. Their actual sewage. Which Sydney Heath made me change that word from a curse word. Is this A, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, B, Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, or C, Chinese President Xi Jinping? It is C. It is C. There is a lot of sewage being dumped in the South China Sea. That's right. So, very good. Now you have 2 bottles. Good job. Thank you. Thank you for volunteering. I'm sorry I don't have more games. It's so nice to see what a hit this was. Next time I'll create more. Well, I have role-playing ones. I have all sorts of different ones. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. That is it for the talk, and now we figured we'd talk Q&A. You can ask me anything, so long as it's not about, covert intelligence operations that I wouldn't know about anyway. But feel free to ask me anything about other countries, about careers in Washington, about anything that may cross your mind. Yeah, sure. Oh.
Sorry. Actually,
I
thank you so much for such an engaging and fun talk. I think I can say for everyone that I learned a lot. So if you have a question, please line up behind one of the 2 microphones here at the front of the room. Please make sure to keep social distance and try to keep it to about 3 to 4 people max on each microphone at a time.
No, go for it, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, and nice to see you again after
Likewise.
class today. My name is Theo. I'm a junior at CMC. My major is Gov IR dual. This is kind of a long question, so bear with me, but we saw how quickly a state's commitment to nuclear non-proliferation deals can change based on which leader is in power at that specific time. And now that Biden is trying to repair the damage done by Trump by abandoning the Iran nuclear deal, how do you think reaching the nuclear deal will be more difficult under Abraham Raisi's regime? And how can we prevent any progress being made during Biden's administration from backtracking again with a change in US presidency?
You know what's so funny is that in my outline, that's not working. In my outline, I was supposed to talk about Ibrahim Raisi, and I forgot because I don't like to read outlines very in great detail. So Ibrahim Raisi is more of a hardliner than his predecessor, and he's a blatant human rights abuser, right? And he's been sanctioned as such. But that said, if he wants to maintain power, then he's going to have to find a way to lift sanctions. And so he has an interest in a deal. He's going to try and have his cake and eat it too, right? But I expect it to make it a little harder, right? There are a lot of hurdles now that the Biden administration has domestically and with Iran, on part because of Ibrahim Raisi and in part because we have to prove to the world now, and European partners in particular, that this deal is not going to go anywhere, that Congresses might have to ratify it, that there's going to have some kind of lasting effect. But I ultimately, even with Raisi being this human rights abusing thug, he still deep down has this interest, and he has repeatedly said that he wants to get rid of sanctions. And if that's really his goal, he knows the only path to that is through a nuclear deal. So I expect it. He might be difficult, but I expect it to take place. Did that answer all your questions?
And how can we prevent any progress being made during this administration from backtracking? Let's say if a new Republican president gets elected.
Oh yeah, no. The only way is to have Congress ratify it,
okay.
Because technically, it is within the power of a president to dictate the foreign policy, and to do these kind of agreements, right? It's not a treaty. Treaties require officially, legally ratification from Congress. And when Obama did the Iran deal, there was a lot of criticism from Congress saying well, we have to approve it and we should be allowed to do that. And the argument on the Obama side was, well, it's not a treaty, it's just an agreement. So it's a deal that we pursued. But that ended up backfiring because if you don't have buy-in from leaders on both sides of the aisle, which means that you don't have buy-in from the American public, then it could be very fleeting. And that's not for our foreign policy, for the better of our foreign policy. We don't want to project that we're fickle and that depending on a leader that things could just disappear, because then nobody will do business with us, right? In terms of these types of deals.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure. This side, so we'll alternate sides.
When you ask your question, please be sure to also state your name, major, year, and college.
Hi there, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Josh Morgenstein. I'm a first year here at CMC, planning on majoring in IR. I had 2 brief questions about Iran. The first one is, before I say the question, let me state that I agree with your characterization of Soleimani as a very bad person.
Yeah.
But, at the time that he was assassinated, he was very beloved by the Iranian people. His assassination antagonized them. He was a fighter in the region against ISIS. And when he was assassinated, he was in Iraq on his way to Yemen to broker a peace agreement between the Houthi rebels and the Saudi-backed coalition. So given those, even though he was a very bad person, do you feel like his assassination advanced U.S. interests in the region? That's my first question. And then my second question, also about Iran, is that let's say that they are successful in enriching enough uranium for a nuclear weapon. How do you feel like Saudi Arabia will react to that? Because when MBS isn't buying an English soccer team, he's funding Sunni militias in Iraq and in other places. Do you think you will see any action with the militias, or do you think that Saudi Arabia will even try to proliferate themselves if Iran is successful?
I'm going to have to get back to your second question. So
Okay.
on the first question, this is a tricky one because the answer is yes and no. And some of it is that it's not foreseen. We just don't know how things are going to play out, right? The Iranian government still wants to avenge for the death of Soleimani. And so in that case, it could very well harm our interests in the region, depending on what they do, right? They've already enabled and allowed, the Iranian government, have already enabled and allowed militias in the region to pursue provocative attacks against U.S. military bases in Iraq, right? So you already have that problem. There was a plot that was, like I said, that was foiled, where they wanted to kill the U.S. ambassador to South Africa. And they're not done, right? They've been provoking a lot of the vessels that are in the Persian Gulf, and that's a major risk because a quarter of the world's oil goes through that body of water. It's a very important waterway. So in that regard, one could say, well, then it's not going to help national security interests for the United States because there are all these threats that are being posed. But I would argue that you kind of faced all those problems beforehand too. Under General Soleimani, he sent a team to cross into the United States through the Mexican border to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States. Now, I'm not, obviously, as you can see, I have no interest in defending the Saudis, but that threatens not just the Saudi ambassador, but it's a threat to the United States in general, to if they're planning to have plots like that are masterminded by General Soleimani, he masterminded that, to go into the United States and pursue that type of behavior, it puts all Americans and U.S. national security interests at risk, right? And the thing about Iranians liking him is kind of a mixed bag, because a lot of, in particular, when this happened, I was doing a lot of the analysis for the cable news networks, and the cable news networks very much wanted to harp on, like everything President Trump does is bad. And as you can see, for myself, as you can see, I really don't have much of a political agenda. I was a civil servant for a long time. I was obviously politically appointed under Obama at the end. But I analyze everything from an objective standpoint. And I remember telling a lot of the anchors at the time that people just weren't aware of how much bad stuff Soleimani was up to, and that Iranians themselves don't all like him at all. And the reason is because he was a big part in growing the power of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and therefore the human rights abuse that came with it. So all those people that you saw in the streets protesting in Iran in 2009, and then after that, none of them are going to like General Soleimani, right? And that is a large group of Iranian people, So nobody has an actual estimate, but it's not very clear. So the answer in short is, it's hard to know fully because we don't know how they'll avenge for his death, and they will. But I think that in the long run, it'll be better for the region, which in turn is better for U.S. national security interests, because you don't have that kind of mastermind who is he is the one who figured out how to use militants like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis and so on to advance and export Iranian influence across the region. And ever since his death, it's not going as well as before. Some of that is because of sanctions as well, but still. So your second question I didn't follow so well. Can you repeat the second question?
Yeah, just like how Saudi Arabia would react to Iran successfully enriching enough uranium for a nuclear weapon, whether they will pursue nuclear proliferation themselves,
Right.
or whether they'll increase funding to Sunni militias in places like Iraq.
It's probably more the latter. The Saudis don't really have the ability, technical or know-how, to create a nuclear program. If they wanted to do that, it would be years away. So again, you hear a lot of cable pundits being like, it's going to cause an arms race. It's not going to cause an arms race. That's not the concern. The concern with the Iranians developing a nuclear weapon is the threat that it poses to Israel. And us, because we are going to go defend Israel, right? So we don't want to be swarmed, swallowed into a regional conflict. But what they would do, honestly, is run to the United States, the Saudis. They're going to run to the United States and ask for something in exchange, some kind of defense pact, some kind of money to put towards a weapons program. They're going to ask to buy arms again. They're going to ask for something to balance the power in the region again. And that's how we became part of the Yemen coalition. Obama never liked the Yemen idea. He never liked Saudi's idea to go into Yemen. He certainly wasn't, he didn't like what the Houthis were doing either. But when he agreed to be part of the coalition, and what we did and still do is provide intel cooperation and like tactical cooperation for the Saudis, and we sold arms. Right now, those arms are on hold. But he did it because of the Iran deal. It was after the Iran deal happened, and the Saudis felt that they were less secure, which is kind of ironic, because what you're saying is kind of the opposite. If there is no deal and they develop a weapon, but the Saudis would react the same way. They'll come to us and maybe others and say, like, we need some kind of assurance that you're going to protect us and that we're not going to be left alone.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
In the interest of time, this will be our last question of the evening.
Last? Okay.
That's a lot of pressure, but hi, my name is Joseph Zong. I'm a first year at CMC, planning on dual majoring in econ and IR. I wanted to thank you for your talk. And my question pertains to the UN sanctions against Afghanistan, especially the Taliban. I wanted to get your opinion on how effective they would be in making sure that the Taliban keep their promises about human rights violations, like minimizing human rights violations.
So I'm sorry, because I didn't hear very well because of the mask. Don't take your mask off.
Okay.
I mean, it's up to them, but like, I don't care, but I don't want you to break the rules. You were saying because of the sanctions against the Taliban at the UN,
the effectiveness of the sanctions of the UN in helping promote greater human rights in Afghanistan.
Oh God, because I don't have good news for you on this one. So you see a lot of people talking after the collapse in Afghanistan. You see a lot of people saying like, oh, well, perhaps, even the White House said this, like, oh, well, it's up to the Taliban to show the world what their plan is and to show the world what they decide they're going to be, what kind of role they want to play in the international community. And they've already decided what role they want to play, and it's terrorist thugs. And we know that. They're criminals, right? And the reason we know that is not just because of how they behaved in the 90s, but because of how they've continued to behave up until today, right? They've controlled areas in Afghanistan prior to this collapse. And in those areas, they were killing people, brutally repressing them. I mean, you could do something like, we'll get it later. You could do something like have the wrong SIM card in your phone. They could assume that they could just accuse you for whatever it is, and they will literally imprison you, torture you, kill you, you have no idea. If you talk to a woman on the phone who's not your relative, this specific story happened, they will imprison and maybe kill you. And so they had, for the areas they controlled, they stopped girls from going to school and women from working. So we already know how they're going to be. And then they proved that once they took over and they started, throwing a lot of this banter, like, oh, don't worry, women are going to work, and don't worry, girls are going to go to school. It's one of the first things they did was close schools, prevent women from working. And when women protested in the streets, they beat them with metal batons. So that's what they're going to pursue. The sanctions at the United Nations, I don't think will be enough to change their certainly not their human rights behavior. The thing that makes this so depressing is that when the United States doesn't have leverage in a certain country, then usually you try to use other countries to pursue leverage somehow, who have leverage, right? And the countries right now that are dealing with the Taliban are 4 of them. It's China, Russia, Turkey, and Qatar. And China in particular, and I think maybe all of them, but China in particular has financial interests in Afghanistan. They're hoping to do their whole debt trap diplomacy where they offer a loan to the Taliban and say, hey, you know, we know you want to mine these rare earth materials that are not mined yet in Afghanistan, or you want to build a highway to get to them or whatever. We'll do it for you, and then you can pay us back. And then when they can't pay back, then the Chinese will take over, you know, that certain piece of land or whatever it is. But the problem is those 4 countries that I just named, all of them have bad human rights track records. So if we go to them and say, like, listen, you're offering this to the Taliban, can you include in your deal an ask that they allow women to go to work or girls to go to school or whatever, they're just not really going to care to make that argument for us. Now, whether those countries are able to pursue those kind of economic deals remains to be seen because of those UN sanctions, right? Like China saw dollar signs when all of this, with all this that has happened, and they shouldn't jump to that conclusion so quickly because of the sanctions. But the thing is, the Taliban in the 90s found that they were very easily able to survive until the US and coalition forces invaded. And that was with sanctions, that was with people around the world not working with them. And I just don't think that it'll be different this time, especially given the hand they have in the drug trade over there. Afghanistan produces 90% of the world's opium, and that has continued to go on, and they have a very heavy hand in that. And so I think they'll find a way. Like a lot of terrorist organizations, they find these, you know, most of them are very savvy, and when you close a loophole, they find another way around it to finance themselves and so on. So unfortunately, I think it's kind of a long slog that we have ahead of us with the Taliban in power, the human rights abuse that they'll bring, and the breeding ground that'll be created for terrorism. It's a really positive note to end on.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Afghanistan is a very depressing story.
Please join me in giving our speaker a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you like the merch. Make sure you take the merch, and there's only one thing I would beg of you, and as I told my head table, I am not beneath shameless self-promotion, which is to go to the YouTube channel and click subscribe. I fight for every subscriber. It means the world, no, you know, pun intended. Thank you so much again.